So then we will start this first lecture. You are all very, very welcome to this master level course on sustainable development and sustainability science. It is organized by the Swedish Aral Sea Society and coordinated in Uzbekistan by Karakalpak State University in Nukus. It will consist of 15 meetings, lectures, and this is the very first one. We will start from the very basic question, what is actually sustainable development and how did it start? So the deep roots, as I call them, the first one I picked up is around 1700. So 300 years ago, you see a devastated forest landscape, and it's in Saxony in Central Europe. The king there, August the Strong, he was very concerned about mining silver in particular, but mining in general. It took a lot of forest timber to melt the ore and also build the shafts and so on. He was a very interesting king, liked women very much. But anyhow, he understood that this has to be dealt with, so he asked his forester, his royal forester Karlovitz, is the one you see on the picture to the upper right, to solve this deforestation crisis in some way. And he looked very carefully at this and wrote a book about management of forestry. And in this book that came out in 1713, you see the word sustainable development is Nachhaltigkeit, as it's called in German, for the very first time, as far as we know. So this was one way to deal with it, to manage the forest properly, to replant and so on. The other example I want to mention here is in Sweden. It was also a lot of deforestation because of using timber for mining iron. So they were cracking the stones and they were melting, of course, the iron ore and so on, took a lot of forests. So the same thing happened here. The very newly formed Swedish Academy of Sciences asked two people to solve the crisis in some way. So they developed a very efficient stove for heating, which took much less wood to make a good and nice and warm homes and buildings. So this is a channelized stove you see on the right-hand side. So this is just two examples how it was addressed in those days. And in fact, those methods are used also today, together with more methods, but anyhow, management skills. It was on the Handbook of Forestry by Karlovitz in Saxony. Technical solutions, the channelized stove, insulation of buildings and so forth. Substitution, also particularly in Sweden, they used peat instead of wood to burn, and there are more things to say about this, but it will come later. So here you see that deforestation is still a very, very important aspect of what's going on in the world. Deforestation in particular is serious in the tropical forests, where huge areas are cut down, millions of hectares every year, to be used in a non-sustainable way. So this was the first deep root, deforestation. The other I want to put up is 100 years later, around 1800. Then in English language came
Lars.
out... Yeah.
Du ska väl byta bild, va? Slide.
Ja, nu byter jag bild.
Ja, jag ser inte det här. Men...
Oj då, jaha. Jag bytte bild. Ser du inte min nya bild?
Det är fortfarande den första
Nej.
bilden.
Första bilden.
Jaha, det förstår jag inte riktigt. You share. Nu?
Ja,
New bild, okay. So you see 1800, the book came out on the principle of population. It was a British or English scientist, Malthus, who asked himself if the resources of the world will be enough to feed the huge and growing human population. And this it was at the time when there was 1 billion people on the planet. So, and of course, the question if the resources of the world is enough to feed the population is still around us, and it's more acute. Here's a problem with sharing screen. That's an advanced. I have a small problem with sharing the screen and advancing the pictures. Here comes the next picture. Do you see this new picture?
yes.
Very good. Okay. So so you see that at the time of Malthus' publication, we were there. It's 1 billion, 1800. Today, we have about 8 billion people living on the planet, and it's still increasing. It's projected to be 10 or so billion in a few decades. And then this should be the maximum, and then it's going down. So it's still a concern about the number of people and how they could provide for themselves. Let's see if this is working now. You see a new picture?
Yes.
Very good. Now it's working. So this is about a third route, which is nature protection. And it's around 1900, so it's 100 years later again. So some people in the Swedish parliament started to be concerned with the nature up in the north should be protected from, exploitation like mining, building, and so on. So this was the first national park in Sweden, 1909, up in the north. And of course, there were some such protection going on in the United States even before that. For example, Yosemite National Park and so on in the Rocky Mountains. And of course, it's still going on, protection of nature on many places. You see this, your picture?
Yes.
Very good. So today, one of the more interesting projects when it comes to protection of nature is rewilding. So there are a number of sites in Europe, huge areas, which are rewilded. It means they introduce the original fauna. From here, as you see, European bison or Vicent in Romania. And it's similar on 6 other places in Europe. You have huge areas, and then you have quite many small areas that are being rewilded. So they try to introduce the original ecosystem as much as possible. So these were the 3 deep roots. The modern developments with more modern roots begins in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, it's important to point out nature protection. And the real big start for nature for environmental movement is the book Silent Spring by American marine biologist Rachel Carson, published in 1962. The the name Silent Spring was based on her observation that birds were actually killed by chemicals in the environment. And the chemical she was particularly concerned with was DDT. You know, it's a chemical produced artificially to control insects. But in fact, it was accumulating in the ecosystem, and the concentration of DDT in, especially in birds of prey, became very big, and it killed the bird and it destroyed the reproduction. And also smaller birds were killed. So this is why she called it Silent Spring. And of course, not only Rachel Carson, also other chemists and analytical chemists were finding artificial chemicals in the environment that destroyed the fauna. For example, to the right, you see a white-tailed eagle in Sweden. It was found to contain enormous amounts of dioxins, so it could not reproduce. And the number of white-tailed eagles in the country were really reduced in a catastrophic way. Now, these chemicals were outlawed in the 1970s, so there are much less of them in the environment. Another very important modern route is the Limits to Growth publication 10 years later in 1972. This was a project that was financed by the Club of Rome. It's a group of industrialists and politicians and so on that could come up with the money. And the study was carried out at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, around Boston area in the United States. And they looked at the consequences of the ongoing economic growth using more and more resources. And they looked at a lot of statistics, and they used a computer tool called System Dynamics, looking for a system that could be sustainable, not collapse, be controllable, and able to satisfy all the basic material requirements of all the people on the planet. This is a little what it's about. You see, human consumption was modeled based on a lot of statistics. If it continued without any change, the so-called business as usual, then it will come to an overshoot, a maximum, and then suddenly collapse, go down. And also the carrying capacity of the resource, the planet, our Earth, would be destroyed. So this is what they predicted would happen if we didn't do anything. So that's why it was called limits to growth. There are limits to growth on a unlimited planet, simply. And which are these overshoots? Well, the overshoots are fossil fuels. We are using more fossil fuels than we can. We are overfishing, that is, we are catching more fish than the seas are able to provide for us. Deforestation, I already mentioned. So these are some of the unsustainable uses that will lead to an overshoot and collapse if nothing happens. Sustainable development requires that we change this overshoot. This is also from 1972. It's a very famous photography of our planet, our Earth, from one of the Apollo missions. It's called the Blue Pearl. You know, our planet Earth is seen in the universe, in the big space, as a blue pearl. And the blue is actually the very, very thin membrane, the surface of the planet in which we are living. Is very thin compared to the whole planet. And that's where we need to be very careful with that one. So 72 was a watershed year. The Limits to Growth publication I mentioned. Then there was in June that year a United Nations conference on environment, the global environment. It took place in Stockholm, and invited were people from the entire world, including developing countries, so-called third world countries. And it was very clear that environmental issues were connected to social issues. We need to have a sound development taking care of both the environment and social justice and development for the poor people. This 1972 conference will soon be 50 years old, and in Stockholm there will be a Stockholm plus 50 meeting in June this year, just a couple of months ahead. And of course, then I mentioned also the photograph of the blue planet. So now let's leave these roots and go on to asking ourselves, what is actually sustainable development? Little more, say, theoretical. Is there a definition? Are there conditions that we need to fulfill? Are there some empirical issues and so on? So I will start very simply saying that sustainable development could simply understood as sustainability is a state which may continue in the longer term, forever. Sustainable development is a development which brings us closer to sustainability. You know, there are hundreds of definitions of sustainable development, but I like this very simple one. It should also emphasize that sustainable development is a system study. Things are connected. So as an example, I take your country, the Uzbekistan, and the Aral Sea. You see, this is where it looked like long time ago in red, which you all know, and now it's much less than on this picture, in fact. And what happened with the drying out of the Aral Sea is that you have ecosystems collapse, nature is affected. It's followed by a collapse of the economy, loss of fishery. It means that the health and well-being of the people living around here, which we know, are having health problems, and the society as a whole is more or less collapsing. So you see, things are connected in very many ways. Sustainable development is a systems study. We have to look at many aspects. It's not, you know, you can't stay being only engineers and so on. You have to look at and understand the whole system. Sustainable development is also a statement of justice. It's a new ethics, if you wish. And of course, the most famous aspect of this is the publication of the Brundtland Commission in 1987, where they defined the sustainable development as a development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That is, we can't destroy our planet for the coming generations. And of course, needs is now a very important word here. What does it actually mean? Need is what we really have to have. It's not one that we want to have, just perhaps for egoistic reasons sometimes. This is called intergenerational justice. It's justice between this generation, us, and coming generations, our children, grandchildren, and their children, and so on. So let's look at conditions which we need to fulfill sustainable development, to make it possible, what is needed. And this was very carefully studied by one university around here, if actually, Chalmers, and they were able in a big research project to define 4 principles, which they call the fiscal conditions for sustainable development. Number 1 is that substances from the lithosphere, that is the Earth, may not systematically accumulate in the ecosphere. Very simple example here is, of course, fossil fuels. If fossil fuels is systematically accumulating, as we do, there are consequences. For example, climate change. And principle 2 is human-made substances must not systematically accumulate in the ecosphere. Simple examples here is the accumulation of DDT, as we saw in the Silent Spring study, or say dioxins, which is also another example. Principle 3 is the fiscal conditions for production and diversity may not be systematically deteriorated. For example, overfishing makes the production of fish impossible. The climate change challenges the biodiversity because the conditions for all the different species of our ecosystems cannot continue to live as they did. And principle number 4 is the resources used must be efficient and just. And of course, this is not really a physical principle. It's more of a, say, a social or a ethical principle, but they put it in here. And based on these conditions, there is one organization called the Natural Step Foundation that used them to make companies in particular more sustainable, but also say cities and so on. So they look at it and see if the conditions are being respected. And if not, they make a change in how the companies are run to make them more sustainable. But you can continue. In fact, it's also possible to define 4 biological conditions for sustainable development. It's quite easy if you look at. Recycling is the first. That is, everything has to be recycled. This is what you see in nature. Everything is recycled. Waste does not accumulate somewhere. It's being reused. For us, for example, it's very clear that we have to recycle, say, various elements like metals, but also, well, everything actually. Second principle is the energy part, that is ecosystems use sunlight as their source of energy. Sunlight warms the planet. It is also used for producing green, you know, and in all that. And this, and of course, it's also used in various ways for producing electricity nowadays, which of course is not ecosystems, it's us. And the third principle is the size of the consumer population should not be too big. Of course, we are seeing we are breaking this when there are too many people in the world. And of course, when it comes to biological situation, if it's too much, they will simply stop growing because they will starve to death. And important to remember is that biodiversity is maintained in the ecosystems. Of course, with the growing concern about biodiversity, this is not maintained as we are running the planet right now. So these are systems that we have to look at, the conditions to be respected. And in fact, I put together this myself, social conditions for sustainable development. If the population is not growing in an unsustainable way, it means there will be more old people than we are used to, so to speak. We have an aging society. This we see in many countries, including Uzbekistan, including Sweden. In fact, in Most countries outside Africa, it's like that. Also, we have to share our resources in a just way. This is called intra-generational justice, justice between us living here and now. This is not respected very much. Some people are becoming extremely rich and others are quite poor. And of course, we can't base our welfare on non-material or on material values. It has to be based on non-material values. We can't expect everyone to be happy by consumption. It's not possible. There is not enough to consume. So, but we could base welfare on, for example, being together with our families and so on, rather than having a very, very advanced car or several cars. We have to use other ways of getting happy. And also it's important to point out here that sustainability, economic growth cannot go on forever. We have to find a non-growth economy in some way. And that is not the situation in any country today. We may also look at sustainable development as an empirical question. Do we find societies which are sustainable and those what are not sustainable, and see what is the difference? And this is a very famous book when it comes to this. It's called Collapse, because it describes 14 societies which did collapse, which did not respect the conditions for sustainability, and actually they collapsed. For example, you see the Easter Island in the Pacific, which is one very famous example, but there are several others, for example, in Central America, or for that matter, the society on Greenland. He has 14 examples, and which are the principles that he found. But very often it's deforestation. Forests were cut down and land animals and fisheries overused. But he has several principles here why things went wrong. Technical development, economic pressures, denial mechanism, tragedy of the common, value questions are his short list. And we'll look at it more in detail here. Why did people make disastrous decisions that led to these collapses? Well, one which he sees on several places, the problem was not understood, anticipated, or recognized. They simply did not understand what was happening. For example, Easter Island. It's similar to creeping normality, a denial. They don't want to face the problem because they want to continue to live like they always did. This is something that is typical for our societies, for very many people. They simply deny the challenge of climate change, for example. There are economic interests which are, trying to survive. That is companies which are earning a lot of money on the way it is right now, and they don't want to change. And in some countries, survival from day to day, especially in poor countries. For example, if they have to collect the wood for burning to cook their food, sooner or later the wood will be destroyed. So that's, of course, one other example of deforestation. And tragedy of the common, it means that a common resource is not managed properly. So everyone has to take as much as he or she can before it is emptied. This is tragedy of the common. And this can be overcome by common management of the resource. And of course, we have value questions, especially religious values, which we see in some countries, religious values are more important than anything else. For example, in your neighboring country, Afghanistan, this is a question. Let's end this part of the lecture by looking at possible future scenarios. You see here, you have the possibility of the future looking at these curves. You have the one with overshoot and collapse. This is called no fun at all. And you have various versions of more or less present possibilities and something in between. So this is the overshoot and collapse. You have exponential growth that we have. It's about 2% yearly, looking at economy. 2% yearly means that you have a doubling in 35 years. And then you have quadrupling, 4 times more in 70 years. And in 100 years, you have 8 times more, and so on and so on. So this is not possible with an exponential growth without a collapse. That's what the limits to growth pointed out. So this is not a very nice scenario. Secondly, you can think of, balancing this is so-called dynamic equilibrium. That is, you adapt to the resources available. It's also called sustainability, of course. It means not too much and not too little. You have what we call in Swedish lagom, not too much, not too little, sustainability. And look at this curve. You see, on the what we looked at from the limits to growth point of view, it's this one. So it's unsustainable technologies and practices, use of fossil fuels, destruction of nature, pollution, poverty, inequity, in other words. And you have this that we are working with to become more sustainable. You get aware of the problem, you start to conserve nature, you start to use renewables and so on. And this is the cutting point. If these sustainable practices becomes more important than the unsustainable practices, we have a transformation. This is what we need to realize. You see, it is our time of lives. That's when we live, is right now. This is what we should try to achieve. So now it's break. You should discuss and formulate some comments and questions, and we will talk about them after 10 minutes or so. And then we discuss that about 20 minutes, and then there is a second part of the lecture. So thank you very much. Now we have the break. Now here we are. So you see here, discuss and formulate comments and questions, and then meet and discuss. Do you see now there is a new picture? Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we look. Now we will look at the let's say here. The modern roots of sustainable development. We'll start by looking at this so-called World Commission on Environment and Development. It was headed by the previous former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland. So it was called the Brundtland Commission. And their report, Our Common Future, was published in 1987. And I already mentioned this one. It was very important for looking at sustainable development. The following one was in 1992. It was the so-called United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. It was possible to organize such a conference in 1992 because it was just after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which I'm sure you are very aware of that, since Uzbekistan was a Soviet republic, but it's not any longer. This conference was perhaps the largest conference ever organized. There were about 70,000 people there. It's called the Earth Summit. And here you can say that sustainable development was solid on the global agenda. Now you have to turn off your microphones. Everyone who is just listening, please do that. So please turn off your microphones. Please turn off your microphones. Please turn off your microphones.
Bolalar. Avazdan öçürüp koyuyorlar deyapti.
Okay, so as I mentioned, the Rio conference in '92 established sustainable development on the international agenda. The conference produced 5 very important documents: the Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration, and 3 Rio Conventions. And then in the United Nations headquarters in New York, the Commission for Sustainable Development was established. So it's a very important year, 1992. The Agenda 21, as you see to the left there, it is a publication that explains how we should work on sustainable development in the coming 100 years, the 21st century, Agenda 21. It consists of 40 chapters, and the whole text is actually negotiated. So everyone on the conference had to agree on the text. Of course, it was not possible. It was not very nice for some of the countries, but actually it was ended up with that. The Swedish diplomat, in fact, a friend of ours, were putting together the very end of it. So it came out. And there are chapters on, energy, of course, on schooling, on water, on forests, etc., agriculture, and so on. So it's a very important document. To the right, you see a picture of the meeting itself. So 193 countries took part. There were 70 heads of states coming to the conference. So it's very, very important one. The 3 global conventions, which I mentioned, is the Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and the Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD. And these conventions are addressing very crucial global issues: climate change, biological diversity, and desertification. And of course, with the goal to reduce these impacts. And all these conventions have many countries, in fact, over 190 countries, practically all countries in the world, as parties to the conventions. And they meet every year, more or less, in the so-called conferences of the parties, COPs. So you see, these conferences of the parties are huge conferences. Now, these conference of the parties and the conventions themselves are not so easy to work on because it relies on consensus. That is, everyone has to agree if there is a statement from the meetings. And it is not always possible, but sometimes it is, in fact. So there have been steps ahead on each of these conferences of the parties. In a few cases, there have been protocols agreed on. And protocols are different. They are binding obligations of the parties. So they are, very detailed what to do, how to monitor, how to report, and sanctions if you don't fulfill the protocol. So that exists as well. And of course, then we should look at the Agenda 21. It is a concrete agenda. It says what to do, but it's not so detailed in terms of how to measure, how to report, and which are the goals, etc. That is different from the next agenda that was actually agreed on at the UN General Assembly in its 2000, the Millennium meeting. And the Millennium Development Goals were goals that were supposed to be met at 2015. There were 15 years to work for these goals. So that was next agenda for the world. And the third agenda for the world that we are working on right now is the 2030 agenda. I will come back to that one. When it comes to the Millennium Development Goals agreed on in the year 2000, there were 8 of them. And there were a development compared to the Agenda 21. They all had a goal, that is what should actually be achieved in 15 years. They all had a way to measure what we were talking about, and there was a protocol for how to report them. You see there are 8 goals, and now we can ask ourselves, of course, how did it work out? Was there a success or not? And I would say when it comes to goal 1 and 2, it has been quite successful. It's not eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, but today there is about 500 million people living in extreme poverty. Before it was much more. We will look at the picture soon. Universal primary education. Every child should be possible to go to school. And of course, this is true today for more than 90%. Also girls. When it comes to gender equity, child mortality, maternal health, it's much less successful. Almost nothing happened. When it comes to HIV, AIDS, malaria, and of course today we should say COVID-19 as well, it has been sort of steps forward. When environmental sustainability, not at all successful. And global partnership, perhaps a little steps forward, but not that terribly much. Look at just as this picture, which has to do with extreme poverty. And it started at 1990 with 1.9 billion people living in extreme poverty. And in 2000, you see it when the Millennium Development Goals was established, it's still quite much, almost 2 billion. Now, I have to tell you that if we look at the picture for the year 1800, so it's much, much before, it almost the whole population on the planet was living in extreme poverty. So it's much better compared to how it was. And now you see in 2015, when the Millennium Development Goals was supposed to have been reached, there were about 730 millions living in poverty. And today it's about 500 millions living in extreme poverty out of 8 billion. So it's 12% or so. You see almost all of these live in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa, so-called Black Africa, south of the Saharan deserts. So that's the situation today. Well, I don't have a picture for education, but it's also quite a positive picture. Now we should look at the present agenda we have to work on, Sustainable Development Goals. This was agreed on in 2015. It was actually the work after 2 years of lot of working groups. And you see here, these working groups agreed on 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. You might think that 17 is a very large number to keep track of, but in fact it's not so difficult. It's dominated by social goals. You can see no poverty, no hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equity, and so on. Everything is about social goals. And then it's about resources, clean water and sanitation. It's not at all for everyone today. Affordable, clean energy. It's not at all. Decent work, economic growth. Then notice economic growth is only for poor countries, not for rich countries like Sweden, for example. Industry and infrastructure, of course. Inequalities, reducing inequality is we are far away from that. Sustainable cities, it's improving a little. Responsible consumption and production, goal number 12. It's a very centrally placed goal. They are all connected to each other, and this is almost in the center. And then, of course, we have climate, we have marine life, we have terrestrial life, and we have cooperation, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So that is the 17 SDGs. They were agreed on in October 2014 after 2 years of work with very big working groups. And they were agreed on by the General Assembly of United Nations the 25th of September in 2015. So we are now halfway into this 15-year period when it should be reached. These goals are even more worked out compared to the previous agendas. The goals are all quantifiable. They are all reported according to a scheme. There are 169 targets, that is what to achieve exactly. And there are indicators, several of them, for each target. So it's much detailed agenda we're working on quite now. The so-called Global Agenda 2030. So if we should reach these goals, we have to make very big fundamental changes in how we live on this planet on Earth. This is called transformation. Remember this word from the first lecture, transformation. That is what we need. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. The second part of the course is reading. So you have some reads to do from this first lecture dealing with historical background and concepts. And they are all available digitally on the homepage. You see the link to the homepage in the end there, and I think you will have them also for each student group. And the first one is some small text that was developed in the Baltic University program, which is a university cooperation around where we live. Just as you have a university cooperation where you live, we have one here since very many years. So this is possible to see there. And then you have chapters from 2 books that was actually written together with your teachers and researchers in Uzbekistan. It's also available on the homepage. So that is the reading task you have as students. Now we come to the third part of the course, the student seminars, which I don't know if you have heard about, but every student in the course will give 2 small presentations and comment on 2 other presentations. That's your job. And this will happen in seminars that we will arrange 1 hour after the end of the lectures. It should be 17 hours Uzbek time from lecture 2 to 14. That is from next Wednesday, we will start. Not today, but next Wednesday. So there will be 3 presentations more or less each time. So there is a total of some 40 presentations with comments. So each student will make 2 presentations and 2 comments. And to make this possible, we have divided the students. You have divided yourself in 4 different seminar groups. The first one is in Nukos. The second one are the students in Samarkand. The third one is the students in Tashkent. And the fourth one are students in Urgench and Izak. And each group will have their own teacher, Swedish teacher, and a local teacher, and they will have their own Zoom link. So this is it, presentations. They should be about 5 minutes, and comments should be at the most 5 minutes. So they are small. They should be in English, presentations and comments in English. And of course, there are some slides shown also in English. So notice here, all students should be able to understand spoken English and speak themselves in English. They should be able to understand written English and write themselves in English. Topics related to sustainable development, that you choose a topic that you think is interesting, you want to work with, but agree with your local teacher so you know it is acceptable topic for sustainable development. And then do it carefully, preparation and slides and so on, and read instruction for the seminars. It was distributed instructions. And these are the groups. The Nukos group, Rustam Eshniyazov is the local teacher, and Gunilla Björklund will start as the international teacher. And you see the 3 presenters the first time next Wednesday, and 3 commentators next Wednesday. And you see the link for your group. And the same with the Samarkand group. I will be the international teacher, and there will be local teachers, like, for example, Abdur Gadayev. And I picked 3 students for presentations and 3 students for comments. And there is a link for this group. And Tashkent, Björn Frostel will be the international teacher. We did not yet get the names of the students. And there's a link. And then the 4th group is Urgench Izak students. Bo Liebert will be the international teacher, and there will be local teachers. And there are students for presentation and students for comments. So that is what we needed to do today. So thank you very much. This presentation will be available on the homepage. So thank you very much. I will then simply thank you very much for today and wish you good luck for the whole course and for your starting the seminars, and hopefully learning something about sustainable development, being able to apply it in your life and in your work in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.